Welcome back to the Judgment Files. Today we're going deep on a case that's had a huge impact on how the police can interact with people, especially when it comes to questioning and interrogations. It's Miranda v. Arizona.
Oh yeah, a landmark decision for sure.
You shared some sources with me that hint at the power dynamics involved in these situations and really how important it is for individuals to know what their rights are.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to unpack this Supreme Court case, try to figure out why it still matters so much today, and even get into some of the disagreements and dissenting opinions surrounding it.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's jump right in.
Okay, so right away, one of the most fascinating things is how the Supreme Court set this whole case up. Chief Justice Warren, he wrote the opinion for the majority of the justices, and he made it crystal clear that this case wasn't about creating some brand new legal principles. Instead, they saw it as taking rights that were already there in the Constitution. Specifically, the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination,
Right.
and the Sixth Amendment's guarantee of the right to counsel.
Lawyer attorney.
Exactly, having a lawyer there to help you. And he really emphasized that these rights weren't just something they came up with out of thin air. They were the result of centuries of struggle against the government trying to overreach and take too much power.
So it wasn't like a sudden change or something. It was more about ensuring those really fundamental rights were actually being upheld,
Precisely.
especially in the very specific situation of being questioned by the police.
Yeah, that's a high-pressure situation.
For sure. So what exactly did the court decide in Miranda? What's the main takeaway?
The core of the decision is that if the police get a statement from someone during what they call custodial interrogation, that statement can't be used against them in court unless the prosecution can show that specific safeguards were in place.
Safeguards meaning?
Basically, procedures to protect the person's Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate themselves.
So they don't accidentally end up saying things that could hurt them later.
Exactly, because the court recognized that being interrogated by the police can put a lot of pressure on someone, and they might feel compelled to talk even if it's not in their best interest.
Okay, so custodial interrogation. That sounds like we need to define that term.
It's crucial.
Because police officers talk to people all the time.
All the time.
In all kinds of different situations. So how did the court make it clear when these Miranda rules actually apply?
They were very specific about it. Custodial interrogation means questioning that's started by law enforcement after a person has already been taken into custody or when their freedom to do what they want has been significantly restricted.
This is not like a casual chat on the street corner.
No, not at all.
Or even a few questions during a traffic stop.
Right.
It's a much more serious situation.
It is.
Where the person is basically under the control of the police.
Exactly.
Think about being formally arrested and taken down to the station. That's a clear example of being in custody.
Yep.
So if you're driving along and an officer pulls you over and asks, "Do you know why I stopped you?" That's probably not custodial interrogation yet.
Probably not.
But once those handcuffs go on,
Things change.
that's when the Miranda rules kick in.
Exactly.
Because now your freedom is significantly restricted.
Right.
And those rules, they lay out the warnings that have become so famous. So what exactly are those warnings? What did the court say the police have to tell people in those situations?
Before they start asking any questions.
Before any questions.
The court was very clear. First, they have to tell the person they have the right to remain silent. They don't have to say anything at all.
Okay, what's next?
Second, they have to be told that if they do choose to talk, anything they say can be used against them in court. It can be used as evidence.
Makes sense. And the third warning?
They have to be informed that they have the right to have an attorney present during any questioning.
A lawyer right there with them.
Yes, and if they can't afford to hire a lawyer, they have the right to have one appointed to them by the court.
So the police can't just question someone without making sure they know they can have a lawyer present.
That's a key part of Miranda.
The court was very clear that these warnings aren't just suggestions.
Definitely not.
They're mandatory.
Unless law enforcement can come up with some other way that's just as effective to make sure the person really understands their rights.
And the timing of these warnings is crucial.
It is. They have to be given before any questioning starts.
Not after the person's already started talking.
No, it's about making sure they know their rights before they say anything.
Okay, now let's say someone read their Miranda rights, they hear all the warnings, but then they go ahead and start talking anyway. Does that automatically mean they've given up those rights?
Not necessarily. The court was careful to address exactly what it means to waive your Miranda rights.
To give them up.
Right, and they said that a person can certainly choose to waive those rights, but that waiver has to be voluntary. knowing and intelligent. It can't be because they felt pressured or because they didn't understand what they were doing. The police can't just assume they've waived their rights just because they answered a few questions.
So it's not a simple yes or no.
Not at all.
There are a lot of factors involved.
And here's another important point. Even if someone starts answering questions at first, if at any point they say they want to talk to a lawyer, or that they don't want to answer any more questions, the questioning has to stop immediately.
Right then and there.
Yes. They can't be pressured or tricked into continuing until they've had a chance to talk to their lawyer.
And until they agree to start talking again.
That's a critical protection.
It really shows how concerned the court was about the whole atmosphere of these interrogations.
They were very concerned.
They actually spent a lot of time, in their opinion, describing these incommunicado interrogations in a police-dominated atmosphere.
Yeah, they didn't like what they were seeing.
They talked about how people in these situations are often isolated,
Cut off from anyone who could help them.
and facing questions from law enforcement officers who are in a position of authority.
And who often have a lot of experience with interrogations.
Right, so there's this inherent power imbalance.
Absolutely.
And that was a major concern for the court.
They wanted to make sure the playing field was a bit more level.
To prevent abuse.
Exactly.
And they even went back into history to give context.
They did.
I remember the opinion talking about the third degree and instances of actual police violence from earlier in the 20th century.
That was a big part of their reasoning.
They mentioned reports like the Wickersham Report
From the 1930s?
that showed just how common physical brutality and coercion were back then, especially when the police were trying to get confessions.
They really wanted to paint a picture of how things used to be.
And while they acknowledged that maybe those really blatant tactics weren't as common anymore, they were very clear that the potential for coercion was still there.
Even if it had become more subtle.
And they even cited some more recent examples of police misconduct.
To show that this wasn't just a problem of the past.
And here's where things get really interesting. The court didn't just focus on physical coercion. They also addressed psychological tactics used in interrogations.
Oh yeah, the mind games.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize, how these psychological pressures can be just as effective as physical force.
Sometimes even more so.
The court recognized that modern interrogation techniques often relied more on manipulation than on outright violence.
They were getting more sophisticated.
And it's amazing that they actually used real police interrogation manuals from that time
The actual manual.
to show what these techniques were.
It's right there in the opinion.
They found that officers were being trained to conduct these interrogations in very specific ways, to make the suspects feel isolated,
Alone and vulnerable.
and to make the officers seem like they were absolutely sure the suspect was guilty,
Even if they weren't.
and sometimes to downplay how serious the crime was.
To try to make the suspect feel like it wasn't a big deal.
And they even mentioned specific tactics, like the friendly-unfriendly approach,
Oh yeah, good cop, bad cop.
where one officer acts tough and aggressive, and the other one seems more understanding and sympathetic.
Hoping the suspect will open up to them.
Exactly. And all of these techniques, even without any physical violence, are designed to wear the person down and make them more likely to confess.
To break their will.
And that was the court's main point, that even if the police aren't physically hurting you or directly threatening you, the entire situation of being in custody in this unfamiliar and often scary environment and facing these trained interrogators
Who are trying to get you to confess.
can create so much pressure and anxiety that anything you say might not really be voluntary.
It might not be your own free choice.
And that's why those safeguards are so important.
To protect people from feeling like they have to talk.
The court even mentioned the Miranda case itself
The actual case that led to this decision.
and pointed out that Ernesto Miranda, the defendant, had been described as having some mental health challenges.
Which made him even more vulnerable in that situation.
They used that to illustrate how some people are especially susceptible to these kinds of pressures.
And how important it is to protect everyone.
So the court's conclusion was that without those procedural safeguards,
Like the warnings.
any statement obtained during a custodial interrogation couldn't really be considered reliable.
Because it might not have been truly voluntary.
And this protection against self-incrimination is not just for the courtroom, is it?
No, the court made it very clear that the Fifth Amendment's privilege against self-incrimination isn't just limited to trials or other formal legal proceedings. It applies in any situation where someone's freedom is being significantly restricted. and where they could be forced to give information that could be used against them later in a criminal case.
Like during a police interrogation.
Exactly.
It's interesting, though, that the court also acknowledged the need for effective law enforcement.
They did.
I mean, they weren't trying to make it impossible for the police to do their jobs.
Right, they were walking a fine line.
They specifically talked about the FBI.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation.
And how they had already been advising suspects of their rights.
For quite some time, actually.
Even before Miranda.
Mm.
And they used that as an example to show that it is possible to conduct thorough investigations while still respecting people's rights.
They wanted to make it clear that they weren't trying to tie the hands of law enforcement.
But they did want to set some clear boundaries.
To make sure those rights were being protected.
They also briefly mentioned some legal practices in other countries.
Like England and Scotland.
That had safeguards in place during questioning.
To show that the ideas in Miranda weren't completely unheard of.
But of course, not everyone agreed with the Miranda decision.
Oh no, there was a lot of pushback.
There was a pretty strong dissenting opinion.
Written by Justice Harlan, and joined by Justices Stewart and White. They really didn't like the direction the majority was taking.
What were their main arguments against the Miranda ruling?
They argued that the majority's decision was bad for the Constitution. They thought it went too far, and that it would make it much harder to enforce the law effectively.
They were concerned about the practical impact on police work.
Very much so.
So what were some of the specific points they made?
Well, one of their big concerns was that they thought the court was overstating how much coercion was actually happening during police interrogations. They acknowledged that there's always going to be some pressure when someone's being questioned by the police, but they didn't think it was as widespread or as severe as the majority made it out to be.
And they were worried about those new rigid rules.
The ones requiring the specific warnings.
They thought those rules would lead to a big drop in the number of confessions.
Which could make it much harder to solve crimes.
And they argued that this would ultimately hurt public safety.
Because criminals would be more likely to get away with their crimes.
They essentially saw Miranda as a risky experiment.
That could backfire and make things worse.
So taking all of this into account, what does this deep dive into Miranda v. Arizona really mean for you?
For the average person, I think it highlights this fundamental tension that exists in our legal system between wanting to effectively investigate and prosecute crime and at the same time protect individual rights and liberties.
Especially when people are dealing with the power of the state.
The police, the courts, the whole system.
And Miranda is really about trying to find that balance. In the specific context of police interrogations, it really forces you to think about power dynamics and how important it is to know your rights.
Because just being aware of those rights can change how you handle any interaction with law enforcement.
Especially in a situation where your freedom is at stake.
Absolutely.
And the Miranda case itself is a fascinating look at how our legal system works and why these protections became so crucial.
It's a window into a really important part of our history.
It raises some really important questions, too.
It does.
Like, did the court strike the right balance with Miranda? Has it actually had the intended effects on protecting individual rights and making sure law enforcement can still be effective?
The debate about that continues to this day.
Which shows that Miranda wasn't the final word. There's still so much to think about and discuss when it comes to these really complex issues. So as you go about your life, think about those inherent pressures that can come up whenever your freedom is restricted, and how knowing your rights can really shift the dynamic in those situations.
Knowledge is power.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts on the balance the court tried to achieve with Miranda? We'd love to hear your perspective. This is a crucial area of the law, and we encourage you to keep learning about your rights and what they really mean. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Miranda v. Arizona. We'll see you next time on the Judgment Files.